Not again, not again, not again. Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. I'm Bradley Tuck, and in today's episode we are going to be talking to Benjamin Noys. In 1909, the futurist Marinetti wrote the founding and Manifesto of Futurism, in which he declared, "We affirm the beauty of the world has been enriched by a new form of beauty, the beauty of speed. A racing car with a hood that glistens with large pipes resembling a serpent with explosive breath. A roaring automobile that seems to ride on grapeshot that is more beautiful than the Victory of Samothrace." From as early as Marinetti's Manifesto from 1909, the avant-garde has been drawn to speed and acceleration, and in the case of Italian Futurism, willing to tear down anything that is in its way. In this session, myself, Bradley Tuck, will interview Benjamin Noys about his 2013 book, Malign Velocities, which charts the darker history of the avant-garde, focusing on the embrace of the cult of speed, technology and capitalism, tracing the story through Italian Futurism, communist accelerationism following the Russian Revolution, fantasies of integration with the machine, the cyberpunk futurism of the 90s and noughties, apocalyptic accelerationism of the post-2008 moment of crisis, and the negative form of terminal accelerationism. Drawing upon a plethora of references, Benjamin Noys critically challenges this tradition, calling instead for a new kind of politics that challenges the supposed pleasures of speed without simply countering acceleration with the desire to slow down. Benjamin Noys is Professor of Critical Theory at the University of Chichester and author of books such as The Persistence of the Negative and Malign Velocities, Accelerationism and Capitalism. This session was recorded on the 10th of March, just prior to the COVID-19 lockdown, and recorded as part of the Exploding Appendix Avant-Garde Art Practice and Research Group. The Exploding Appendix Avant-Garde Art Practice and Research Group meets fortnightly to discuss art and ideas loosely related to the history of the avant-garde. So I wanted to sort of start by sort of just asking a really general question, which is that the word accelerationism, to me, there's a number of things that kind of come to mind. So one is something like that sort of slogan, you know, things have to get worse in order to get better. Yep. Another thing is that what's sort of a focus in here, which is the cult of speed. And then there's also this sort of strange relationship between technology and also capitalism. So I was wondering, how would you define those elements? How would you define accelerationism, and how would it relate to those kind of elements?
Sound starts. Like Japanese. Or David Lynch. Yeah, it really is. So yeah, I mean, I should say that I coined the phrase accelerationism as a critical phrase. So I only say that because the way in which culture works these days is varies. Other people are often said to have done that, but I did that. So I coined the phrase in about 2008 when I was doing some kind of blog writing, when that scene existed with a few other friends, Nina and Mark and people. Primarily Nina. Nina was the most important person in that scene. No one really talks about Nina Powell. So I was writing a blog post and I was talking about people like Baudrillard, Lyotard and Deleuze and Guattari, a group of French philosophers in the 1970s who in various ways embraced what I called accelerationism, which was for them, I think, in the short version, which I sort of do at the start of the book, is that they were aware that capitalism was becoming, or was, a kind of all-embracing system. So how do you fight against that? And I think at that point in their work, they changed their work in various ways later. They saw one possible solution as embracing it in one sense and kind of pushing it further to a point of collapse. So it wasn't an embrace of capitalism as capitalism was a good thing, but it was a kind of exacerbation or a kind of working through of its excesses or its possibilities. So I guess that's one meaning of the word accelerationism. Then came along the Accelerationist Manifesto by Nick and Alex, which was a kind of readoption of the word in a positive way. They saw it as a positive thing, and they argued it's something the left needed to embrace the possibilities of technology. If you haven't read it, the Manifesto's online. It's a kind of interesting text. So they gave it this sort of positive spin. That annoyed me. So I decided to write a book about why that was kind of wrong. And there I wanted to kind of... What was weird is lots of talk was going on about accelerationism, and still does, but there was no real texts about it. There was the Manifesto, and there was what I'd said critically, but there were, people were sort of talking about it without making what I thought were any substantial kind of arguments. So I wanted to try and do what ended up being Malign Velocities, was a kind of small history of it, to try and identify different moments, and I stress different, because I try and point out some commonalities, but I think the moments I pick up are different, and different ways of thinking about whatever accelerationism means. So I think it is, for me, I try to respect the ways it's been used in different ways, and I get told off not doing that, which annoys me, because I think I try to respect the different ways in which people use it. So it can be used in the sense of embracing capitalism, it can be used in the sense of repurposing or engaging with technology, and as I try and do in the book, I try and identify it with various other avant-garde moments. I think it is, I was thinking about this because that's the kind of premise of Exploding Appendix. It is a very avant-garde kind of thing. As you know, avant-garde means the frontal attack. It's a military terminology. It has its own sense of engagement and acceleration built into it, and in various ways, if you look at the avant-gardes, I think most, if not all of them, try to embrace some kind of version of that logic of speed or acceleration or excess, and which we can talk about is also interesting, the reinvention of those avant-gardes that takes place later in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and even today, I think are all very sort of self-conscious, referring back to that. So there's something, you have the original avant-gardes, which I've identified over the 20s and 30s, you have the 60s and 70s avant-gardes, and the reinventions of them today seem to me to kind of strive in various ways to kind of capture that energy or that moment. So there's lots of different moments of accelerationism.
Yeah, because there's one of the things that's interesting about that book is that it just deals with so many different moments, I guess.
Yeah.
That they seem quite disparate, but at the same time, there is some sort of through line that kind of connects all of these. One of the main themes I think in this one is this kind of role of the worker being kind of reassessed, and especially the worker becoming almost melded with the machine.
Yeah. Yeah, it seemed logical to me. So there is a logic to the moments I select. So let me try and remind myself of which I read first, the first few. So, I start with a framing about accelerationism, but then I start with the Italian Futurists, because they are the primary expression of the cult of speed and acceleration. That's what the Futurist Manifesto announces. Then I wanted to look at the communist avant-gardes as a kind of response to that. Then this kind of integration or melding with the machine through kind of moments in the 60s and around techno, and then the sort of 80s, 90s reinvention around cyberpunk and some other examples. But yeah, for me the logic was this kind of invention and reinvention, and also running through that. So your thesis might be on labour was something that struck me as one of the kind of questions that ran through this. Although these are artistic movements, the question of the worker and of labour and artistic labour is kind of central, I think, to all of them. And the relationship between art and labour and what work might be like, I think, is part of the kind of utopian and dystopianism of accelerationism. So yeah, for sure, I think that's one of the things. I'm critical. I guess I always think if you really love something, it seems to me there's little point in writing about it because you're just going to say it's great. And if you really loathe something, there seems to be little point in writing about it because you're just going to say it's terrible. So I tend to write on things that cause me a vague state of anxiety. I'm interested in this, but I think there's something here, or there's a problem here, or there's something that I'm not sure about here. I guess accelerationism is more down the end of disliking, but I thought it has to say something interesting, otherwise why waste time on it?
I mean,
that's what I'm trying to do. I think weirdly at some points I've been mistaken for an accelerationist, but I always think if you're going to criticize something, you best do the best job you can reconstructing why people would have liked it. That seems to me a kind of primary duty of a critic. If you can't explain why something's liked, then you're going to have problems.
No, it does. It definitely feels very much like a positive. Well, not positive, but it's not completely rejecting it.
No.
It's quite sympathetic in some respects.
Yeah,
I would say probably more sympathetic to some of the people like Nick Cernick and Alex Williams, possibly. Is that? Would you say that?
Not personally.
Not personally.
Well, that's a story. Not on my part, that one. I think probably most sympathetic, I guess, to someone like Mark Fisher, because we shared a common formation. So some of this is a kind of common formation. So some of those things about speed or about music or about techno, which for me arrived as a kind of thing that I'd never expected or thought would happen. And then jungle and drum and bass, which I listened to a lot in the 90s. So there was a kind of common cultural formation that I share with Mark, although I disagreed with him about a lot of things. And when I read some of the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, Nick Land stuff at the time when I was also I'm an ex-MA student at Sussex and an ex-doctoral student there. So I was reading that stuff in the 90s and I didn't think it was right and I didn't think it was very good then. And part of my reaction was, there's a weird 90s revival going on. I wouldn't have expected that because the 90s didn't seem to me that wonderful. But that's when you do a PhD, nothing probably seems that wonderful. So I was kind of also interested in this sort of return and repetition of ideas from that moment. You were talking about Deleuze, the sort of dominant Deleuzianism that's taken place in the 21st century. Mm-hmm. So I share some kind of common ground with this thought. At the same time, I guess I'm an internal critic of it because I do think it's problematic and wrong. So that's where I'm sort of coming from.
Because sometimes I think that the aesthetic is really compelling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, even if you disagree with the politics, there's something that really draws you in by the aesthetic.
Yeah, but I think the thing I've always thought is you can't split aesthetics and politics.
Yeah.
And partly for reasons that, as Walter Benjamin argues, fascism treats politics as aesthetics. That's how fascism operates. It treats the making of politics as a work of art, including excluding the things you don't want, which is the fascist move. So I guess I'm always reluctant to split aesthetics and politics. I had this conversation with a friend Evan about black metal, which is something he wrote about and I wrote about. So it's like his argument is like terrible politics, like really interesting stuff, and I'm like, it's interesting stuff, but is that interesting stuff also related to the terrible politics? Which I think it is in that case, because I think the kind of chaos and weirdness that black metal can explore and produce is partly their own kind of quasi-fascist, because some of them are, denunciation of the present. The aesthetic is trying to portray chaos, not because they love chaos, but because they want to kind of go beyond it. So I often think, while you can sort of say the aesthetics are great, politics are bad, it's interesting to see how the two interrelate. And also, I think in the case of something like techno or drum and bass, to look at the actual art work itself, and which I tried to do in the techno chapter, and say that it's more complicated. Techno isn't just about speeding up, isn't just about acceleration. The original pioneers were explicitly all based in Detroit, in the suburbs. They were like African American but middle class, and their music was focused on, as they said, the robots on the production line at Ford. They were trying to kind of embrace a futurism. As you know, Detroit has become the poster city for urban destruction and kind of virtually apocalyptic levels of social destruction. But they were interested in the new production lines. They didn't want to be Motown. They were kind of stripping out soul and the voice and kind of doing all this stuff. So this fits a kind of accelerationism, but at the same time I think there are things going on within techno that also are interrogating concepts of labour and work. within the aesthetic. So I don't think it's simply a kind of euphoric embrace of speed, even in its own terms. It's more interesting to see it as a kind of working out of these problems, coming down to the way you make techno. Because partly what's interesting about making techno is you make it with machines. The machines embody human labour. You know, you can be a band on your own now. You don't need to have umpteen other musicians. You can have, you know, the 303 famously, the sampler, the 808 drum machine, these various drum machines and sample technologies allow you to produce this music kind of on your own. And even your own labour is technologically mediated. So while workers are being replaced on the production line at Ford, in the music they're also being replaced by the machines themselves. So there's this kind of interesting dual relation between the production of the art and its own content or form.
Well, actually, I think I've got a clip of some of that music, actually.
Oh, good.
And now for a brief intermission. Drexia's Anti-Vapor Waves from the album The Quest from 1997.
was really interesting what you were saying about how coming out of Detroit, being a very working class, industrialised place.
Yeah.
It was almost like creating a sort of music that was exploring like a dystopian downfall for, of the very city that it was coming out of.
Yeah. I mean, Derek May explicitly says this in some liner notes on one of the albums. If I quoted here or something else they wrote, he said, there was New Order in Britain making sort of music like techno. And in fact, one of the other interesting things about techno is how influenced they are by sort of things like New Order and stuff, and Kraftwerk, obviously, stuff like that. But he said, we are the new disorder. So Detroit is not a safe place then, wasn't and still isn't, as I understand it. So it's a weird kind of, very hard to pin down as kind of, utopia / dystopia at the same time. You've got this kind of music this is, I guess, down the dark end in terms of bass line and stuff. But you've got some of the Model 500 and some of the Derek May stuff, which is very kind of sweeping and almost kind of classical / soulful in intent. So the kind of response to that is this strange mix of things. But for me, it was just like, this is really different to anything I've ever heard before, and perhaps it's one of those things that ages you when you can't get over something and you think everything else after is not as good. But it's like, it's not as good. And some of the 80s and 90s techno I still think is like really, really good.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
You spoke about Mark Fisher earlier.
Yeah.
And I recently reread the sort of unfinished work of Acid Communism.
Yeah.
And the fact that he talks a lot about sort of 60s psychedelic music and the beginning of that kind of aesthetic.
Yep.
As this, like the way I kind of saw it is it's the mirror, like the negation, I suppose, of that accelerationist aesthetic of speed, where the psychedelic kind of had this qualitative kind of other temporal aspect, things slowing down and shifting and time sort of melding, like kind of floating away and no longer really being registered almost. And I'm wondering if there's almost like a deceleration sort of musical kind of aesthetic, if this might be if like drum and bass and jungle and techno and electro might be the flip side of that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, because Mark killed himself, we'll never know. And I think it's very strange reading. The fragment is very fragmentary. Yeah. I expected, actually, when they published it, there to be more. But it does seem like an inversion of everything that he'd done before. Because, in a way, coming back to this sort of way you read a kind of artwork or you interpret it, Mark and Nick Land and the CCRU had always kind of gone for the dark side jungle, as it's called. So they were interested in the techno and drum and bass that played on the machine and machinic integration. So they were like the stuff that was sampling Terminator, which, Terminator, as I've used it here in Brighton for an image, Terminator is a good image for the whole kind of that version of the Accelerationist program. So they explicitly embraced the dark side kind of jungle, techno, drum and bass against, which I have some sympathy with, the kind of Second Summer of Love, 1988, hippie rave culture kind of interpretation of things, and in a kind of anti-humanist kind of against soul and the voice. Because one of the things that you get in both techno and drum and bass is this series of sampling of the voice and the distortion and shifting of the voice, particularly in jungle. There's a pitch shifting, so it's where you get chipmunk vocals when it's released. So it's weird reading the Acid Communism thing, because that seems like a kind of entire rewrite of that history. I was talking to a friend, Alberto, who knew Mark better than I, and he was saying another friend had met Mark and used the word soul, and Mark had denounced them for like humanist residues. What people forget about Mark is it wasn't always that nice. So yeah, the Acid Communism thing seems to me a very strange project. And then the Acid Corbynism thing seems more bizarre. Oh yes, yeah. Oh yes. So yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that it doesn't feel very integrated either, or even as an antagonism. Like, I was wrong, I'm going to go back and criticise myself. So that's to me the project just seems to have appeared
like a tangential kind of.
Well, no, it could have been the whole new direction, but it's weird. I suppose I find if you've been arguing something and then you change, I guess I expect self-criticism.
Right. Yeah.
I don't often get it. I guess
it's not really
nowadays the way is not to self-criticise, and the way is, which Mark wasn't like that, I don't think. But nowadays the way is just to move on. It was the first thing the accelerationist thing did was like start to say, oh, we're not accelerationists now. We've abandoned that. It's like the classic logic of pop culture / contemporary media culture. It's like, we're no longer doing that. We're hipper than that. So I kind of I've got a bit of a kind of backward way of looking at things, and I like to go back and think, well, why have you abandoned that? Was it exhausted? even their own projects, things that I didn't agree with. Have you exhausted everything about that, or have you just decided to move on to something new because the logic of the new? So again, I'm kind of interested in going back to these sort of moments that people leave abandoned, because, like I said, in the 90s thing, if you don't, you just end up kind of repeating them in slightly weird and boring ways. It's like, do we have to go back and do the same thing again? Those one of my strange commitments to potential human or social progress might mean we don't need to all make the same mistakes all the time. Some of us could tell each other about this thing didn't work out quite as well.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to do a different project.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the acid communism thing and that culture shift. It's not that I don't have any interest in sort of 70s psychedelia or stuff like that. It's more through friends playing it. But I think it feels very much like this should entail a lot of criticism, and it doesn't appear to have, or the project didn't happen. So yeah, that's my take on that.
So I was going to possibly play a little bit of go back maybe to the futurists.
Yeah.
I made a little video, so...
Yeah, sure.
And now, for a brief intermission, a segment from Francesco Bellila Pretella's Leviator. Italian Futurism in some ways seems almost like the quintessential kind of Malign Velocity in some sense. It's got that sort of very dark side, especially with sort of Italian fascism. To what extent does it sort of remain this kind of bad thing? To what extent can we sort of kind of positively or critically kind of engage with it?
Well, I think the futurists are important because they are the quintessential kind of avant-garde movement. They have all the elements that will become the avant-garde are there. The exact date, 1909, for the founding Manifesto of Futurism, which Marinetti, who was relatively wealthy, which is why he got it published in the French newspaper, so it comes out in France, because obviously the futurists were well aware of what they saw as the provinciality of Italy as a country and their own kind of second class status, and partly that's why they wanted to accelerate. They saw Italy as lagging behind Europe, Britain, Germany, France in various ways. My favourite futurist moment is that they objected to the Italians eating pasta. Pasta slows you down. Pasta is a retardant to the national self-development, which I think is probably true. And they wrote a cookbook, yes, which I haven't read, but it has a point. They have a point. So, yeah, I think they're the quintessential avant-garde. They published the founding Manifesto of Futurism in 1909, at which point there are no futurists. It's a classic manifesto. It calls into being that. That's what manifestos are, always performative texts, as well as constative. They try to call into being what they proclaim. It has its famous 10 points. Then some of the images of artists that you saw are kind of produced after by people who gathered around Marinetti, excited by this moment. So it's an avant-garde group, a compact group. It lays down the law about different art forms. So there are manifestos for music, manifestos for sculpture, manifestos for painting. It produces work in all those forms. It's a compact group. It has its founding manifesto. It lays down the law. It gathers people around it. One of the other things the Futurists did, which I really kind of admire, is that they took their travelling exhibitions out to the Italian countryside, and they would go to like villages and put on these futurist shows where they would get usually attacked by the local populace. Sometimes the police would rescue them, sometimes the police would join in and attack them as well. But I think there's something kind of admirable in the way in which so much, to be critical, avant-garde activity takes place within people who are already receptive to the avant-garde, within a kind of closed metropolitan milieu. That this idea that they thought, this is really going to kind of galvanise people, and they should be galvanised and work, so we'll go and talk to the actual people, coming again from questions around labour. So I think for all those reasons it's the kind of quintessential avant-garde. Politically, many, including Marinetti, do turn to Italian fascism, and I describe that process in the book. It was a heterogeneous movement, as so many kind of avant-garde movements were. There were anarchists, there were some kind of communists, I guess, but the overriding kind of impulse ended up within a fascist or a quasi-fascist direction. And I think that is partly due to this cult of speed, cult of hardness. It's a very kind of masculinist vision, as I make the joke dark humour, as Owen says. There's a founding manifesto of futurist feminism, made by a female futurist, whose argument is that women should be as strong and hard as men, and basically dissolve anything else. So it's not a kind of counter; it's a kind of reinscribing of gender within the kind of hardness and mechanical. So, I think the reason I start there is it embodies this cult of speed, and it wasn't really much referred to or discussed when the Accelerationist Manifesto came out, or when discussions were happening around accelerationism. And again, as I said to you, I like wait a minute, everyone, this has been done before, or things like it have been done before. Maybe we could go back and have a look at what they do. And I think, and it's not just my argument, there's a critic called Jeffrey Schnapp who does some interesting work on the futurists. You can find his work online. What's also interesting is this integration with the machine. So the cult of the machine with the futurists was not necessarily machines that functioned very well. So they were into like early aircraft, and early aircraft were incredibly dangerous. Basically flying was one of the most dangerous things you could do, and Marinetti did it, and D'Annunzio did it. But part of that became part of the cult, that you had the will and the courage to make yourself part of this machine that was sort of barely staying up in the air and required all your kind of concentration and effort to stay flying. So the interesting thing is that their fascination with the machine is not simply for the machine as a perfect device. It requires this infusion of human will into it to function. And again, that becomes part of this kind of fascist aesthetic of man-machine integrated with the war machine that you get in the celebration of the soldier hero. Also, kind of both speaks to their seriousness, and their many of them joined up and fought on the Italian side. Many of them died on the front, and I think that also changed post-war futurism. So you get this. It's one of the earliest movements, I guess. Cubism and futurism are roughly contemporaneous. But I think futurism, you can say, is the first avant-garde, and whether we like it or not, the kind of model for later avant-gardes. So that's why I sort of started with them.
Makes sense.
And as you can see, they make some fascinating art out of this, and D'Annunzio is not a futurist, but the images you showed of his villa are partly because I actually went there, so I have to include my tourist bit in the book, which I managed to avoid the kind of as I was at their bits that you get in books, which has now become very fashionable, the sort of research book where you turn just writing a normal academic book into as I was walking across to the British Library, it becomes personal. So I managed to lead myself out, but I have seen the villa, and it is amazing because the boat is literally built into the side of the mountain, the side of the lake. And it is this kind of weird. It is this techno-natural, pastoral integration, what we'd probably call now cyborg. I think it emerges partly also out of late 19th century decadence, where you get these sort of combinations of industrial and natural. So again, I think it's another kind of primal scene of something that we're probably kind of used to now.
Yeah.
for better or for worse, this integration of the technological and the natural. So for all those reasons and probably more, I think that's why futurism is interesting.
I've got another one on Russian.
Oh yeah, avant-garde.
And now for a brief intermission. A section from Ivan Ignatiev and the Ego-Futurist group, the first spring concert of Universal Futurism. From the album Baku Symphony of Sirens, Sound Experiments in the Russian Avant-Garde. So I mainly used examples from Gustav and
Yep.
Meyer holding that because I think they relate mainly to the stuff that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But of course, the whole Russian avant-garde is very fascinating in many respects.
Yeah. I mean, so there were also Russian futurists who were communists rather than fascists. So again, the sort of political orientation of futurism is open for a different interpretation, and again in very different ways within the early Soviet project. They would also go out to the countryside on the trains, create agitprop, agitprop trains, agitprop for the streets. There was some of that in some of the exhibitions I've seen on the Soviet avant-garde, which is interesting because it was a Malevich exhibition at the Tate. I don't know if you saw it. It was really good. But beyond proving that Malevich can paint any number of different ways and things, not just black squares. They struggle in the middle to do the Russian Revolution bit because of its like public art, and so they have sort of photographs of things that he was doing collectively. So you go from this kind of painting to this other art mode. T.J. Clarke's book Farewell to an Idea has a very good chapter on the Soviet avant-garde where he talks about that. So again, within the process of revolution, they are interested in a different kind of speeding up, not so much the embrace of the machine for the sake of it, or its kind of cruel velocity, as the Italian Futurists would call it, or its embrace for the use of war, as they were also interested in, but the embrace of technology for the sake of production and to overcome both the limits of the Soviet underdevelopment, the Russian underdevelopment, and also to overcome the limits of capitalist production. So this is the kind of structure or form in which these experiments take place, which Alexei Gustav was both a proletarian poet and founded a workers' institute devoted to trying to kind of make work and workers more efficient, because that's part of the struggle of early Soviet communism after the Civil War, was the complete sort of destitution of the productive base, and basically production was carried out in extremely bad conditions and often in extremely erratic kind of ways. So we often tends to get seen, and I would have seen it probably when I was like 18 and more anarchist, as very negatively, but also at the same time the Soviet state had to kind of continue to exist and produce things, so there's this struggle around labour discipline and organisation that takes place. So the avant-gardes are kind of living the dream of the avant-gardes. They're firmly within kind of state policy, state activity. Obviously then with Stalinism, that involves, as it happened to Gustav, most of them getting executed. But for that period they are part of the central kind of state.
One of the things I find really interesting about some of that stuff is that you get this kind of merging of the sort of Marx on the one hand, but when Frederick Winslow Taylor and and Henry Ford, figures that are kind of quite important in terms of capitalism and the way that the workplace is organised in capitalism. So you get that those two elements sort of coming together.
Yeah, as Lenin Lenin writes an article critical of Taylorism, and then he also starts to suggest it as a method to introduce labour discipline within the Soviet system. And Ford was an object of desire and envy by the Soviets. There's stories about which are true about children being named after Ford or after factories. Or obviously Aldous Huxley makes this kind of joke in Brave New World, but the Dearborn factory in Detroit, we're back to Detroit, it all does fit together, which was the world's largest production facility, which was basically a very large kind of shed, because you need long spaces for production lines, was seen as something to emulate and something to produce to remove the Soviet state from its destitute state. And obviously Lenin himself, it gets the story is complicated and much debated, but Lenin himself realised that they hadn't reached communism. Lenin's point was we have to kind of still create something like capitalism in a weird way to get beyond that. So there were like different competing kind of drives within this. Some people in the avant-garde thought we can go straight to communism, we don't need, we can bypass all this. So the various attempts to kind of model or develop around this were kind of fraught with these tensions between different groups. And at simply a material level, for various periods, the Americans were exporting stuff to the Soviet Union, including tractors and production line technologies and workers. There's a book which I started but I didn't finish for some reason. I don't know what happened there, but about American workers who went to the Soviet Union to work and direct kind of production lines in the late 20s and 30s. So yes, it's a complicated story where the desire for communism is not simply antithetical to a capitalist desire.
Yeah, because last year I was doing a presentation on science fiction and the Russian Revolution. I was looking a little bit at Bogdanov.
Yeah.
And one of the things I was quite, what seems interesting about the difference between Bogdanov and Gasti is that, Bogdanov is somehow about sort of organising the workers through sort of proletariat and all that sort of stuff, to sort of, so the workers can kind of envision a kind of new kind of society.
Yeah.
So it's less about sort of taking from capitalism, but more about actually developing their own sort of vision through these kind of these sort of educational processes within the workplace.
That's the paradox of Gastev's argument. Whether we probably wouldn't sympathise with it now, but Gastev's argument about the adoption of Taylorism was that you could mechanically work, but then you would have time to dream. In a weird way, like having work becoming kind of routine and, as we would regard it, boring, might actually free you for this kind of cognitive labour or cognitive possibilities of dreaming and imagination. So it sounds kind of weirdly paradoxical and unlikely, I guess, to us. But, that's the tension between, a kind of, you can say on the other hand, my work would become like really shaping the new society. But that could be all-consuming of your imagination as well. You could just be involved in constantly working, the sort of the point many anarchists have made about sort of direct anarchism, they don't want to spend my life in meetings. It's like, as an academic, I say heartfelt way, because this kind of constant responsibility for running the state, the kind of direct interpellation, requires its own labour. So I think, there's strange commonalities and overlaps with the utopian dreams between those proposing the sort of fully engaged labour, those proposing this seemingly kind of robotic labour. And these get repeated today in the debates about technology and work today. This is the kind of accelerationist kind of argument is, if we replace our work with machines, then we'll have more time to do fun things. Yeah. And then obviously, yes, that's the counter argument, which I have some or be unemployed. Yeah, that's why. But there was, I always find it in my own work like slightly insane, where colleagues at least can't see the logical argument that if you put everything online and you record your lectures, they could just sack you. You know, it's like it's a possibility. You know, you don't require my living presence. It's the fact that people just don't see that I find rather strange. You know, I see it as some kind of, some being rude to the middle class, but some sort of cognitive kind of gap that you don't see that possibility that could just happen. So I think it would, but yeah, I think it probably would. So yeah, again, you know, this kind of debates around technological employment and unemployment kind of re-emerge.
Well,
So-
it reminds me of Inventing the Future with that,
Yeah.
that whole full unemployment.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Can we interrupt with
Yeah,
this?
certainly. Yeah, go on.
So, humanism is really hard to define, right? It's really hard to specify what humanism is, because the term is quite kind of murky.
Yep.
When you were talking about Mark Fisher and the Nick Land stuff and all the rest of it, I was kind of wanting to ask, can you define the notion of humanism that they want to get away from?
Yeah.
But I was also interested in how that might relate to the difference between the Italian futurists and communist futurists.
Yeah.
To what degree there might be a kind of, well, it's less anti-human, presumably,
Yeah.
than the communist version, and just what, you know, if you could just say a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a kind of philosophical idea of anti-humanism, which is in French, sort of this displacement of the human from the centre of things, which obviously you've seen and does kind of can have a liberatory potential, in that we put humans too much at the centre all the time, and that leads to obviously structures of oppression and exclusion. But there's always a but. But there's this sort of anti-humanism that turns up in Nick Land and Mark Fisher's work is I think this idea that we could disperse or overcome the limits of the human by their integration into the machine. You know, so Land talks about human extinction as a dance floor. You know, this is this kind of, you know, take drugs, speed in his case, I think. You know, integrate with the machinic at this level of being replaced by it and kind of welcoming that extinction of consciousness. So rather than this sort of fraught debate we tend to have about how we as humans relate to machines, the argument is simply just like, well, program us down to the core, or upload us into new kind of substrates, or simply just embrace the full anti-humanist logic of technology. And I think that's why Land has this, I mean, he moved to China but has this slightly weird fetishistic relationship to China, because China, if you know 80s sci-fi, China turns up in William Gibson's Neuromancer as this site of experimentation, and China embodies to us this fantasy, because I think it's a racist fantasy. I'm not saying the Chinese state is great, but it embraces this fantasy. It's a place where they can do anything. You know, the Chinese will not be bound by regulation or law or any humanist concerns. They will simply kind of do whatever they like to people. And I think that's part of this sort of Landian thing. And I still think there are lots of traces in Mark's work, and lots of traces of it in contemporary accelerationism.
Yeah.
You know, it always comes up in the way they treat Nick Land, which is always to say, oh, he had some good ideas. Which ones were those? I struggle to see them. And then coming back to the Italian Futurists and the Russian, I guess, yeah, it would be a difference between the Italian Futurists being more anti-humanist in this sense. You know, war, the world's only hygiene, is one of the announcements in the Futurist Manifesto. You know, it's a welcoming of destruction, welcoming of violence, of extermination, of hardening, of integration with the machine. There are those who will integrate, and there are those who will be left behind, and they deserve to be left behind. Versus, at least in intention or aim, the Soviet avant-garde's more humanist aim to use technological resources to allow the extension of human capacities.
But there's still an integration there, right?
Yeah. To some extent, yeah, that's still...
For the people, you know,
Yes.
in some way.
Yeah. I mean, that's what we were talking about. There's various different ways of imagining it. Either you imagine the human becoming like the machine, which in a sense is the Taylorist thing. You know, you become machine-like in your movements to become maximally efficient. You know, that's what Meyerhold sort of takes into acting as well. You know, there is this anti-humanist drift there that, you know, we're used to acting as like the actor will express the core of human experience. You know, the point of acting is you express these states of human desire, need and emotion that we as other humans relate to. Whereas Meyerhold and others are kind of experimenting, and Brecht, you know, with experimenting with what about if we don't do that. What about if humans are like social types, and all this expressiveness is simply a kind of just a disguise or another form of bourgeois culture, as they would have said? So, you know, can we reimagine acting, you know, not as the expression of bourgeois individuality in its kind of singularity, but as a kind of collective, anonymous process?
Okay.
So I think, yeah, it's the alignments of the different values, like you say, humanism is a word adopted and disputed by many others, but the alignments are part of this debate, where the human lies.
Kind of to follow on from that, I mean, that you've mentioned humanism and anti-humanism, obviously, but does the notion of the post-human have a place in that? Because in a way it's a weird, like, I mean, also I think it does have a lot to bear on particularly like the French theorists that you originally start with, and that also I think brings in the question of kind of the animal as both positioned as another other, but also as something we also biologically systematise and understand, and you know, and we can also, you know, particularly going back to, we can also understand that also at that moment we started to understand biology also as an information coding at the same time that we were developing the computer, which was really, you know, a really interesting, weird thing that was going on.
Yeah, I mean, another thing that probably gets forgotten less so now is Donna Haraway's work, you know, which is not unproblematic, I would say, but is very interesting, particularly if you reread it. Cyborg Manifesto is a famous text which you can easily find online, partly because there's a lot of socialism in it. People forget that bit, and people only excerpt the sexy bit about cyborgs and not goddesses and all the deconstructing binary stuff, and they excise all the stuff about work and in the shortened versions that you find. So yeah, I think they're, you know, the animal, you know, that's, if you like, part of the kind of debate about anti-humanism, and I would have stood on that side for a long while, maybe still part of me does, is that the critique of the human is to like expand it into the animal and the cyborg, and you get this in Nick Land as well, this idea of sort of multiplicities and expansions, but, and that's where I still going more and more, is on the buts, that's still a kind of project that has these dubious orientations towards kind of extinction or blurring in ways that I think are problematic, because you can question the boundaries, I think, certainly between the human and the animal in interesting ways. I'm teaching Derrida, I spent years doing Derrida, and, you know, I think his kind of use of the trace and things about, I talk about dogs smelling things and leaving traces, you know, kind of interesting ways we think of us having language and animals not, you know, it's not quite as simple as that. So I think there are interesting ways to kind of probe these divisions between human and the animal, but within these sort of accelerationist visions, there are also these treatments of humans as animals in the bad sense, you know. As we treat animals terribly, don't get me wrong, we treat animals abysmally, but animals as kind of treated as stock machines, in endlessly manipulable stuff, and, you know, human beings as well. You know, the argument we are just animals can become just, and we could be manipulated as much as we manipulate cows, to use.
Is that kind of inevitable in that logic? Because, I mean, yeah, as soon as we say, oh, that trace is also that trace, then is it a reduction of both our experience and the experience of the dog, and paralleling it, and that leaves it very open to being exploited and
that's a good question.
being written off.
Yeah, that is a good question. I don't entirely know. I mean, I think the Derrida's defence of that sort of thing would always be, if you know, you're not abolishing a boundary, but you are saying it's much more complicated than we thought, and some of the ways that we've drawn the boundary allow the kind of exclusions and violences that we're talking about, which again I would agree with. I think there's a lot to that. At the same time, I think there was some theoretical tendency that I was part of that maybe dissolving those problems, or not leaving yourself with any kinds of safeguards, or not reinventing the safeguards in ways that seem to make as much sense does leave you kind of vulnerable. So I think I've got a friend, Harrison, who's an Hegelian Marxist, who's always criticising me for being much too Derridean or much too French and not properly German. And he has a point. But yeah, so I think some of those resources of dissolution I would have seen as liberatory. I guess there's lots of projects, I don't know about the rest of you, but I find lots of projects, maybe this is narcissistic, but kind of like self-therapy, kind of working through something for yourself. You know, I think my own initial choice of what I did for research, which was Bataille, who's a thinker all about boundaries and transgression. This for me was, you know, folks, was not simply a theoretical choice. It was also to do with various things to do with my own life and position and psyche and stuff. And so again, I think kind of returning to some of this stuff is like, well, why are people getting this out of this? What didn't I think through about this? And trying to kind of rethink through some of the consequences or things that you, I guess to learn anything you have to accept some premises. You know, in a sense it's like, to learn this, it's so weird, I have to learn it, I kind of think it's right. And then you can kind of go through a process of thinking, but is it right? Or how do I know it's right? Perhaps that's just me, but that was part of the way I kind of, I throw myself into things a bit, because that's the way I understand them. So yeah, that's where I would say I think there are problems there.
I mean, there's a lot of kind of talk about the kind of theoretical aspect of accelerationism. I'm just wondering if you can identify anything in our current kind of paradigm, I suppose, that might be indebted to accelerationism. For example, I mean, for me, I think of like the military-industrial complex and the constant need to kind of create the next best drone for you know, and invent wars or whatever, and create this constant push forward. But maybe that isn't indebted to accelerationism. Maybe there's some more nuanced things that are. I'm just wondering kind of if you see anything right now that, you know.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's like coming back to Bradley's point at the start, there's lots of different ways. I mean, I've done some work on drones, partly because I think I'm interested in what I call drone metaphysics. Again, these sort of, I think accelerationism, being analysing these fantasies of integration with a machine, is a useful way to think about drones as well. Because I think we tend to suppose that if we can reach the human element, then maybe we can stop the technological element. And I think actually the way humans are integrated into operating and flying drones means you might not always trust humans in this context. You know, we tend to think if we just appeal to humans, we'll sort this out. So yeah, there's a whole kind of military imaginary. So as I said, with the Italian Futurists, there's this explicit identification. There's something like the German philosopher and thinker Ernst Junger, who's a reactionary kind of right-wing thinker, but very kind of interested in the relationship between technology and the military. He wrote a book called The Worker in the 30s, which influenced Heidegger. He did experiments with drugs. He took not LSD, mescaline. And he lived to something like 102, so there's this Nazis living a long time. He was a kind of weird left-wing Nazi. But yeah, you know, you can trace things through Junger, you know, his embrace of technology and his interest in technology and the worker through this kind of what I would call this sort of military nihilism. You know, where it's just like, what can we do with technology to kill people? And this sort of uncontrolled military nihilism. Frederick Jameson has this line, he says, the two things that seem to show human progress are military technology and medicine. He says, I don't think it's a coincidence that those two things, because they're intimately bound together. So there's that whole strand. And then I guess the other thing that, in ways in which various forms of accelerationism appear, like we could call left-wing accelerationism, is the arguments that Nick and Alex made that were then taken up by parts of the Labour Party and sort of emerged in Labour Party policy to some extent. And the debates are, you know, they've shifted accelerationism, I guess, away from this technological emphasis to this sort of emphasis on full employment, basic income. I can't think of the third slogan, inventing the future, slightly weird third slogan. So you get signs of that, and then you get kind of like amongst artists like Holly Herndon, not my kind of thing, but she kind of adopts sort of accelerationist ideas. people like Ray Brassier doing it in philosophy. So there's the kind of the definitely malign side of certain kinds of technological speedings up. I mean, the other kind of malign side would be the way in which various tech gurus embrace kind of Landian thought and ultra-reactionary accelerationism. They want this kind of feudal future where they will be, it's like Game of Thrones with iPhones, as I call it. They will be the feudal barons with the control of technology, and we will be the peons, kind of serving peasants, serving in the fields. So Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, these sorts of people have a, Nick Land himself, kind of Minicius Moldbug. They embrace what they call this neo-reactionary thought, where the acceleration is combined with the hierarchical. There are those who can embrace acceleration and technology. They have proved themselves cognitively superior. At this point, they can usually claim not to be racist by saying, Chinese people are like good at technology, so they're fine. But they really are racist because it's always African Americans who are their example, who definitely can't be included. I think the military and the sort of ultra-capitalist reactionary side are the kind of offshoots. And then there's this whole other kind of artistic philosophical debate, if you like, about accelerationism as really, I think, a way to think through technology and its uses. So that's how I would see it kind of appearing at the moment.
Because one of the things that you talk about in that, one of the words the phrases that you mentioned at the beginning of that, Deleuzian Thatcherism.
Yes.
So then this sort of comes up again with sort of Nick Land and this kind of notion of a kind of capitalism that would kind of push beyond itself.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could possibly sort of extrapolate a bit.
Yeah, so back in the days before the internet, became the thing that it was, which was when I was doing my MA and PhD. I didn't obviously publish anything. I was talking about Deleuzian Thatcherism, but it was, I guess what interested me at the time, like the late 80s and early 90s, was Thatcher went, and then you had Major. And Major to me was a really interesting political figure, because he carried on and accelerated, if you want to use that word, lots of the dismantling that Thatcher had done, and no one seemed to kind of mind as much when it was done by him. And it seemed a very strange moment. In fact, if you read the Conservative politicians themselves from the time, one of them talked about it as Thatcherism in its Maoist phase, this idea that they would smash the state apparatus, i.e. the welfare state, which of course is why it's all coming back now, because Boris Johnson and people around him are true inheritors of this moment. It's all associated with a Cambridge college called Peterhouse. If you want the source of evil in the world, one of the sources of evil in the world, there are a few sources of evil. Peterhouse College, the Peterhouse Right, so they're known. A Don called Maurice Cowling writes about this. So I kind of coined that then, because I thought these accelerationist ideas that people like Nick Land were writing for the CCIU, which were explicitly, like, say, against socialistic, as they called it, regulation, were anti. This is where health and safety gone mad. That trope emerges from. We shouldn't be constrained. We shouldn't have anyone telling us what to do. Sounds liberatory, except health and safety gone mad means you don't have to die at work. That's part of the point of health and safety. That's why it emerged in a way, because unions and states tried to stop people dying from industrial disease or being adversely affected, like my partner's dad, who's deaf basically because he worked in the steelworks. So those things happen. Health and safety gone mad. So these kind of tropes kind of filtered through this stuff, and I just thought this stuff seems like not very left wing. It was very naive of me, because I just thought continental theory must be left wing. Turns out, kids, it's not the case. Many of them weren't, and still aren't, in any way. So I always thought there was a kind of correlation, if you like, between philosophical radicalism, artistic radicalism, and political radicalism. And I learned earlier than some, I guess, and earlier about different things, that this doesn't always correlate at all in that way. It's slowest to learn about the philosophers. So that was the coinage that I made then. And like I say, with accelerationism, it seems to return.
Yeah.
You know, it's the way, you know, certainly people like Lyotard, Baudrillard, and Deleuze and Guattari most explicitly saw themselves as left thinkers, saw their arguments as left wing. But when you read them, you know, you can, and partly due to people like Nick Land, you can see their kind of political instability. I think that's one of the things I would say about, it's interesting about someone like Nick Land and the CCRU. They did something which I think is very British, in a good way. One of the few things I think is British in a good way, is they took the French seriously. They said, what do you mean by body without organs? What do you mean by dismantling the ego? How would we actually do this? And they did it through, you know, drugs and listening to drum bass, whatever, doing weird experiments with writing and stuff. But they were trying to say, well, this has to be real. You know, if Deleuze and Guattari are making the argument that everything is desiring production, and you know this is at the level of reality, then, and you're serious about your thought changing and affecting reality, then your thought should be consonant with reality itself. Otherwise, you're not serious about what you're doing. And I think there's something kind of interesting about that and problematic, but it does make clear the kind of consequences of a mode of thinking. The other, you know, you see this French thinkers regularly around gender as well, particularly. They're like, oh yeah, we didn't really mean abolishing genders. You know, we just, you know, we don't really mean this. And you see the kind of disparity between the seeming theoretical statements and the seeming interview statements, or the kind of relationship between thought and practice. And certainly there should be an emphasis on thought as a philosophical kind of, you know, it's not just practice. But I think what I liked about Land and the CCRU in their own perverse way is they took statements by Deleuze and Guattari seriously that you can find in Anti-Oedipus. And it's hard not to read them like that. You know, I've had interesting conversations and criticisms from Deleuzians, and you know, and they will talk to me and we will have conversations about it, and they will point out that there's other things in Deleuze, which there are, but there's other kind of elements in Anti-Oedipus, which there are. But, you know, they will say it's very hard to argue, like, you know, with that bit. You know, that does seem to say accelerate the process, the famous bit in Anti-Oedipus. So, you know, I think that's again kind of interesting, the way people were practicing or experimenting with thought, taking it seriously in its own way. But yeah, that reveals its kind of critical problems. So I think there is a continuity between what I call Deleuzian Thatcherism and some of the problems with contemporary accelerationism, which, you know, feed into the current reactionary right. You know, they explicitly embrace that.
It's interesting you mentioned the kind of contemporary right, reaction right. How do you sort of imagine it? I don't think that's quite covered in.
No, because it didn't really start explicitly happening till after the book came out. I've written something on it recently, talking about Heidegger and Jung. Because part of the usual attitude to the right is the right embrace tradition and the past and have no particular interest in technology in the future. And that's wrong. They just have a very... I'm on the left, if you didn't already guess. So, as I was saying in Brighton, in the Brighton talk, you know, if you're on the right, don't worry, you're winning. But you won't agree with what I'm going to say because I'm on the left. But you know, the right do embrace technology. There is technophilic forms of right-wing thought, which include the Italian Futurists, which include Ernst Jünger. I think you can read Heidegger, who often appears to be anti-technology, if you read The Question Concerning Technology, as actually not anti-technological in an obvious way. In fact, quite complex thinking of technology. So there are right-wing embraces of technology, and there are right-wing embraces of the future and futurism. They're just probably not the future you're going to want if you're on the left. You know, I did a piece on Brexit and accelerationism. Brexit is not solely a backward-looking project. You know, I think two things. I think it's a very strongly imperial project, post-imperial project. If you look at the actual life stories of many of the leading Brexiteers, they were born in what they would probably call the colonies, not in Britain. So I think it's a firmly kind of imperial vision, or post-imperial vision of Britain's place in the world. And I also think it's a kind of futurism where the future is America, obviously, where the embrace is an Americanization. The obvious desire to destroy the National Health Service and other forms of the social state, the welfare state, which they've hated since 1945. Don't make any mistakes about that. There's a great conversation between the Anglo-Irish writer Elizabeth Bowen and Evelyn Waugh. So Bowen is an interesting modernist. She's a total reactionary. And she says to Evelyn Waugh about they both consider fleeing to avoid the Attlee Terror. And what they mean by the Attlee Terror is the introduction of the welfare state and those minimal, in some ways, social demands that were met because if you follow Beverly Silver, which I would on this, the working class decided that as we're dying for you, we'd like something back. And she correlates workers' struggles. She does a statistical analysis, kind of proves it, if you like. Workers' struggles with the end of wars. So, it's kind of evident with the Russian Revolution. But you get mass workers' struggles during wars as well, and at the end of wars. And then she has very interesting arguments about why that's a problem today. Because one of the things that happens today, to come back to your point about warfare, is warfare in the West is not fought by mass conscription armies anymore. So there are no previously armed, pissed off workers coming home saying, we want stuff. War is fought by a standing army and mercenaries. It's privatized, or it's fought by a state elite. And this also relates to technology. The reason you can do that is because weapons are so much more destructive these days. You replace workers by technology. You don't need so many men with guns because you have someone with a very big gun that fires a lot of rounds, or you have a drone, or you have an AC-130 attack plane. So in all these cases, like it's happened in work in general, workers are replaced by machines, and that's happened in war too. You have fewer workers serving fewer machines. So that's her argument as to why now you're unlikely to get the kind of mass waves of struggle. Instead, she hopes that, for the hopeful ending, she hopes that she sees two possible forms of hopeful struggle. Struggles by teachers, because if teachers go on strike, kids don't go to school. If kids don't go to school, parents can't go to work. So you can get a rolling kind of effect where it affects other kinds of forms of labour. So you can actually get a more kind of weird general strike, because it kind of cripples the current model, capitalist model. And struggles by in transport chains, which so far have been very equivocal phenomena and often led by the right, truck strikes and things like that. But she sees those as possible because we're very dependent on those. So, sorry, I've got off topic there. On to Beverly Silver's arguments about. But again, these all kind of relate back to issues around technology, work, labour, and social organisation.
Anybody else?
We can talk more about dance music. We can talk more about art and culture forms. I'm quite happy to. I usually.
Where did you write about Brexit and acceleration?
Sorry?
Where did you write about Brexit and acceleration?
A piece in Third Text.
Sorry?
A piece in a journal called Third Text. Third Text, yeah. If you, I'm quite easy to find online. You can always drop me an email and I'll send you the PDF if you can't get it. Yeah, there was a kind of special issue on accelerationism. On Brexit, rather. And I just thought, I've written a few things since doing the book, which is partly the reason why I haven't gone on to other projects. But it's why I think one of the interesting things about accelerationism is it allows you to think about some other things in interesting ways. So it allows you to think about Brexit, I think, in an interesting way. It allows you to think about this thing about, like I was saying, about the contemporary far right. the other way they use technology is the internet. They're all over the internet. So that's where I start with. You would think this is a contradiction. People who are trying to talk about national homelands and racial hierarchies, why are they interested in this? Why are they so devoted to using this, what we see as the image of hybrid dispersed technology? Well, because they don't see a contradiction between the two things. They see they can use a hybrid dispersed technology precisely to establish firmly demarcated national and racial hierarchies. So again, I think it's that sort of sense that we can, we might imagine a technological form necessarily leading to a politics, but it doesn't always work like that.
I suppose one thing that I always wanted to ask you was about how you might envision a kind of positive use of technology, because I think you've said in other places that you don't think that accelerationism means, or criticising accelerationism means rejecting technology.
No, one of the lines I think someone actually literally did say this to me, which is it's like, Ben, do you like technology? It's like, yeah, I've got a phone, it's a fairly decent phone, yeah, then you're an accelerationist. If you put the bar that low, then you're an accelerationist. Yes, this is a kind of trivial argument. I am not currently living in a cave with no industrial technology, nor am I planning to, although between redundancy and coronavirus, it could happen. I'm not ruling it out as a future possibility. So yeah, if you set the bar incredibly low like that, then we're all accelerationists, because we're all, I think, to one or other extent engaged with technology at some level. You could take like the most extreme anti-technological thinker, who I think is John Zerzan, an American primitivist or anti-civ thinker, who I kind of admire people when they take it to the extreme. So he thinks things went wrong for humans when we invented language. It was all downhill from there. I think that's kind of strangely sounds to me to echo it's Douglas Adams who says the mistake was coming down from the trees, doesn't it? It is a kind of Douglas Adams argument. So his argument was that when we invented language as a technology, a kind of symbolic thought, then we distanced ourselves from real experience and real life, and that would only get worse and exaggerated by the Neolithic Revolution, which is the invention of agriculture, and everything went bad from there. It sounds completely crazy, but it's like a weird thing where people ask, where did the Russian Revolution go wrong? And then they ask, where did humans go wrong? And where do you try and trace the kind of original sin? Too. And he still uses like a typewriter, as he says. He says he doesn't think he's a hypocrite, and he's still, I think, online. So even the most extreme anti-technological thinker lives in a technological society. I think the big question, becomes how do we understand or envision the transformation of technology? And my problem with the accelerationists in general, I think, is that they underestimate the way in which technologies are embedded within a class society, and that they're embedded within forms of power that make it difficult to detourn them or reuse them or transform them in liberatory ways. I think they underestimate how difficult that will be. Their proposals like, I'm not original in this, like universal basic income, is highly problematic because it gets implemented in very kind of capitalist ways. Unless to implement it in a way that would actually be beneficial to most people would require you to change a huge load of other things. Otherwise, just they put up the prices, for example, making your life pretty much as miserable as when you started. Or if you, in the UK, if you don't change fundamental things, someone was saying they work on housing, if you don't change fundamental things about housing in the UK, you're going to find it very difficult to change anything else. Helen, who's a student of mine, who's a part of the xenofeminist group, is interested in communal living and talking about that. Probably not for me, but I understand its allure, and I think there are certainly kind of very useful ways in which we could do that. But it would involve a massive change in the way we relate to housing. I live in a very expensive part of the world, Chichester, and we live just north of a very desirable part of Chichester called Summersdale, and the houses are massive. We don't own one of those. And I bet you they're not fully occupied by lots and lots of people. In fact, usually they're being knocked down, presumably when the owners die, and replaced by 2 or 3 houses. That's what's happening. They're also expensive. So I think, the reworking of technology, the shifting of technology, to me, is not the solution, but is part of the problem, and relates to a whole load of kind of problems about, I guess, what we could call revolution, or imagining that, which I'll be honest with you, I struggle to do. I don't think we're in a particularly hopeful situation myself. So that's my problem, that the accelerationists tend, I think, to treat the reuse or changing of technology in too simple a fashion. And that's weirdly why I think they then tend to go to art and stuff like that. It's like, can we aesthetically reimagine it? It becomes a kind of replacement for could we actually change it?
Just following a few strands in that, and kind of like answering the original question, I was thinking about Afrofuturism, and I was thinking earlier, but is this a kind of a futurism that maybe isn't accelerationist, except for in some elements I think it is, and some of the imaginaries are, some of them are awful, but some of them are purposely awful, because they're largely coming from a group of people who know completely how horrific the technological mechanization, what destruction it can bring, and to people's lived experience. So is there kind of something in that, because it does seem to be a different sort of futurism. It arguably, definitely for me it's different than maybe typical cyberpunk. Maybe not even in the overall societies that are imagined, but at least in the kind of personal stories and responses and the experiential value of what's being covered.
I have a bit of discussion in the book of Drexciya, the Detroit Techno-Act, who are Afrofuturists.
Yes.
They imagine a future where the babies of pregnant slaves who were thrown off slave ships, which happened, have kind of grown underwater and created an underwater sci-fi civilization. And this is their sort of Afrofuturist imagination. It's like a counter to the slave trade, which is a technology of labour, technology of oppression. So I think, and I make the argument that there are resources in that sort of reimagination that I think are still emancipatory, or still, partly because they do still retain those traces of unfree labour and the violence of labour. They don't leave that as a problem to one side. They interrogate that. There is a lot, actually, because they're a duo. I can't remember which one of the duo it is. The other part of the duo, they're both African American, has a very weird fascination with genetics and Nazism as well, which is kind of slightly disturbing, to put it mildly. It's a weird, I guess. I don't know what to think about it. I haven't written about it, but I think kind of weird identification with the aggressor, or the way in which kind of racial science that was used to classify you can, be, determined. But that's the kind of weird other side of it. But I would say yes, to some extent, within Afrofuturism, that there are, because it's more aware of these problems of labour and working through in technology. But, part of the influence on Mark McLand, that group, is obviously Codwell Eshel's Brighter Than the Sun, which Verso keep promising to reissue and don't for some reason, I don't know why. His book on techno and dance music, that's a kind of book about Afrofuturism. So, again, it's this sort of, I think those phenomenon bear interrogation. There's also a good online text, I can't remember its by, she's an LA artist, I think. It's like the anti-Afrofuturist Manifesto, which is very funny, because it's like, we will no longer be aliens for you, we will no longer kind of say Africans were the first space people, and it's just this sort of, it's a kind of interesting critical response to the way in which Afrofuturism can be kind of deployed or used to make us all feel better about the treatment of actual African Americans, black people in general. So it's quite. I think that's where I would, I'd see it again, like I would treat it in a weird way, like I treat accelerationism, as a site where there's a problem being kind of worked out, but I have more sympathy, I guess, for that working out. Because I think it really directly speaks to an experience where black people are treated as they are, like they are by, in a way, in Land's work, as though they are too stupid to have technology. And that technology is seen as the marker of racial inferiority, the lack of technology. This is a classic Western kind of trope, that people without technology deserve to be developed because they lack technology. As my lecturer in anthropology pointed out, the fact that most of us don't understand anything about technology, try explaining how electricity works. It's things moving in wires that bounce along. It's like we have an virtually entirely magical, if you like, relationship to most technologies ourselves before we start criticising other people for that relation. There's been some really good work done on Melanesian cargo cults. There's sort of people who they set up their own fake airfields and they build these towers. They're trying to cool down the aircraft, that bring supplies and goods. I can't remember the guy, the anthropologist, but he's pointed out that if you live there and suddenly these planes turn up with a load of goods and stuff, it is weird and magical, and that's just our relationship to the market. That stuff turns up or stuff is absent. Toilet rolls, as we would have an example. It's like the gods turn up and give you stuff, or the gods don't. The market plunges and suddenly you don't have anything, or the supply chains from China fail. And so this kind of, if you like, quasi-mystical relationship that they engage in is about as real and unmystical as our own mystical relationship to technology and to production and supply, where we are in the same position.
You were saying about, accelerationism as you think the thing that it gets wrong is that it doesn't see how technology can't be treated as a theoretical object separated from issues to do with ownership and current capitalism. So do you think a critique of accelerationism relies on some sort of reference to ownership? Because that for me is the big question to do with machines and replacing jobs is the issue of ownership. So if that's the way that things are going, and the machines are going to replace more and more jobs, and then people are going to be out of work and there won't be employment, then the way to tackle that is to tackle who owns the technology. And does that factor into the way that your criticism of accelerationism?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think Alain Badiou, who did a panel with Nick and Alex in Paris, said something like that. He simply said, you're neglecting completely the question of the ownership of the means of production. Yeah. Which is the kind of the Marxist point about revolution is the seizure of the means of production. That's the kind of definition of one definition of revolution in that. They would say, to be fair, I tried to be fair. They would say they are trying to kind of answer that. They are trying to consider questions of ownership. I thought and found that I don't think they do enough. I don't think it's only a question of ownership, though. I also think it's a question of the ways in which technologies are shaped by current relations of production. The ways in which technological forms kind of speak to or engage with or determined by capitalist demands like replaceability, recyclability, kind of reuse. I'm trying to think, some of the research done, for example, like lots of mobile phones that we used to have are now turning up in Africa, where they're primarily used for work, being available for work. So you can be available on the phone to kind of take employment and also to call home if you're working in Europe or working somewhere a long way from home. So again, you have these technologies that are primarily being used to facilitate precarity, or particular kinds of relations of production. And I guess, I think accelerationists themselves would say, we are not saying technology is neutral, we are saying it would have to be reworked. But I do think, that they accept too many of the premises of contemporary capitalist society and not, they are not, if you like, radical enough It's a bit ironic, really, because Nick and Alex and people criticised this book for being social democratic, kind of, which is probably true in some sense. I'm shaped by my own childhood.
How's that different from what they want?
And then wrote a book that was really social democratic. It was a weird moment. It's like, yeah, that was what was weird to me. It's like, oh, you're criticising me for being like social democratic, and then you're kind of writing something that seems very social democratic in turn. But those are the ironies. So yeah, I think it's that dual factor of not thinking about the ownership of the means of production, or nor thinking about the relations of production, and the way they get reproduced within technologies. You know, not just externally to them.
The other thing you mentioned is that nostalgia for the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah. I'm proud of this one. So, you might have heard this thing that they have in the former Soviet communist states called ostalgie, which is nostalgia for the East in Germany. So people who are nostalgic for East Germany and what it did, and sort of drive around in those Trabant cars, or want the old kind of East German products, or various kinds of nostalgia for life under communism. I can't think of the name of the book, the Svetlana Aleevich book, where she interviews people in Russia. That's a really depressing kind of book about the experience of communism and what was lost and what was found. But there are some interesting points where people just say things like, they used to name streets after us, like they used to name streets after workers, and now they don't name streets after workers anymore. Kind of things like that. But and I thought, what's interesting about accelerationism, which claims to be all about the future, is that it's actually a form of capitalist nostalgia. It's a kind of nostalgia for capitalism as being productive. So if, in all these cases there's a big if, I'm not an economist, but, if the economic analyses are right, which they seem to be, there is a kind of downturn in capitalism that starts around 73, 74, and then a switching that takes place into financialization as one of the responses, and deindustrialization, which we tend to call neoliberalism. So you get the election of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the late 70s, 77, 76. That's where we are today. So what's happening, in a sense, is a slowing down in the productive forces, in one way. The production is not as kind of central, and I think a lot of the imaginary of accelerationism is a desire for this capitalist productivity. And it's also inflected by, I think a lot of it was initially created out of the 90s boom, which was this tech boom, which, as you know, kind of came to a crunching halt in 2000 with the collapse of tech stocks. So the one thing that also drives this is the one thing that does seem to be accelerating, or has a material acceleration, is the speed of processing power, which is still following that doubling kind of curve for now. So I think these dreams of the future are actually dreams of the past. I think you could say, to be fair, the good thing about Mark Fisher was, in a way, you have to read Mark Fisher's accelerationism alongside or with his hauntology. That they're not contradictory, they absolutely go together. So he has this thing about being haunted by the past, but what you are haunted by is past unactivated possibilities. So that would allow you to square the circle. Accelerationism would be, why can't we reactivate the past possibilities that we had? So to use the cliched image, speaks to my childhood, why don't we have the rocket cars? Where are the rocket cars that we were promised? Space 1999, why aren't we on the moon? I loved Space 1999 as a kid. 1999 has been and gone. We don't have moon bases. And this weirdly is part of the kind of this is the driver for accelerationism, a sense of frustrated hopes in what technology would deliver. I guess, in my own defence, I was never that naive as to believe that these things were very likely, and that science fiction is called science fiction for a reason. But I think part of the driver of accelerationism is a kind of sense of disappointment. we didn't get what we were promised. And to use that slightly, to me, still slightly annoying phrase at the moment, a kind of sense of entitlement. You know, why didn't we get what we were promised? Which is one of the things that I kind of find most dubious about contemporary accelerationism. I think there's a sense of entitlement about why we didn't get what we were promised, and a sense of entitlement about being listened to. Why aren't we being listened to? Why can't we change policy? Why aren't we being allowed to deliver the future? There's this big thing that goes round. I was talking about this to people. Everyone looks at me kind of like I'm weird about this. But these stories that regularly go around the internet, you know, like only 3 or 4 people read X academic article. So, well, why did you expect more? What are your audience expectations? You know, I mean, do you think you're that important that thousands of people should listen to your every word? And obviously people do. You know, I mean, you realise the kind of sense of entitlement behind that statement. If it's the right 3 or 4 people, I mean, I'm lucky, you know, this sold 4,000 copies, so I don't know if everyone who bought it read it or whatever, but, you know, I'm pretty proud about that, pleased about that, surprised about that. 0 books who took it on didn't think that would ever going to happen, as they said kindly in their first reader's report, which they show you online. They pay me really terrible royalties, so that's great. Really terrible. But yeah, it's kind of, I think there's a weird sense of entitlement behind this notion of we should have been directing the future. We should have been deciding that, which I find, you know, in this kind of fetishization of the think tank. You know, that there should be left-wing think tanks, we should be involved in policy. It seems to me, yeah, just a kind of a subject position, as I used to say, that assumes a kind of very strong say in the world that I find kind of odd. You know, I think there's something admirable to the futurist avant-garde when you stand up and say, right, we're futurists. Like, there's none in the world, but there should be. And you manage to persuade people, you know, and people gather around you and you make some like art and you do some crazy things and yet you do some pretty bad things. But there's something kind of like, I don't know, semi-admirable about that level of ego, I suppose, I find. But I also find it can kind of mutate or transform into this rather toxic or problematic to me sense that you should tell people what to do, which I find to have a very kind of class basis. You know, it seems to me an assumption that, you know, a certain kind of class position that's no longer so clearly available as it was. But, you know, that's one of my other kind of criticisms, is the assumption behind some of the ways in which the statements are made, which I then see in this kind of, oh, we're no longer accelerationists now, you know, we've moved on to something else. So you don't even have the guts to kind of continue what you thought, you know, you didn't take it seriously. I really hate that. I really hate people who don't take what they do seriously at some level, I think. I don't know, it's just me, but I just find that like, well, why did you bother then? Was it just a joke? If so, it wasn't funny, you know, which is my condition for a joke. It should be a comedy. Fair enough if it's comedy, I don't mind that.
There's that objection. There's the objection about the naivety, which is thinking about technology. There's the idea of a nostalgia for a lost past, there's that kind of thing. But one of the things you started off talking about, and one of them, which I understand to be pretty central to everything you're saying about this, is this idea that the way out of capitalism is to go through it rather than against it. Am I right in thinking that's actually the kind of the core of the whole thing for you, or is that not?
Of their views or mine?
Of yours.
My view.
Kind of thing.
Well, my view, I guess, for what it's worth, is that we live in a capitalist society, and I probably think it penetrates or constitutes more of what we do and feel than we would like to think, including ways we imagine of our own freedom from it. So people often say these sort of things like, you know, well then, or whoever's saying this kind of thing, you know, well, you know, there are definitely moments of freedom where you're not kind of working and you're doing this stuff, and you know, you're like, you know, example is I like to swim. I don't get to swim enough these days. But, you go swimming in the sea. You're not being determined by capitalism then. Except, I did buy the swimming trunks, and I did buy the clothes I wore, and my partner bought the car that drives us to the beach, and, paying for the ice cream and the towel that I'm sitting on. So, I don't think we always consider all the ways in which our activities are not solely determined by, but conditioned by, or whatever you want to call it, shaped by. At the same time, I don't think that's a cause for total hopelessness, like we're totally imprisoned within it, because I think capitalism, or whatever you want to call it capitalism, is a contradictory social formation that suffers from its own contradictions and tensions, around labour being the primary one that Marx identifies. I think this replacement of labour by machines generates its own crisis in the value generation generated by labour. So I think there are points of crisis and tension within the capitalist system. The relationship to nature would be another obvious one that we are witnessing both with the coronavirus and with climate change as a double whammy. Then I suppose I don't think those contradictions necessarily lead to revolution, unfortunately. I guess everyone would agree that it's like the automatic unfolding of a class project or a political project.
Towards any such crisis, it's just wrong from the get-go.
I'm always against that, because I think if you think accelerating, my problem with accelerating, maybe in particular instances I might agree with it, but my general problem with about this notion that you accelerate the crisis and you bring on the end is, what about the people suffering in the meantime? And it always seems to me to assume that you are not one of those people suffering. So it's like, okay, let other people suffer. That, coming back to the kind of class privileged position, seems to me a position where you assume that you are floating over the world, telling other people like, oh, it'll be bad, but then it'll all work out fine. What if it doesn't? What if you are one of those people who just dies or suffers, or like many of my relatives have, dies early because of their lives and the way they live their lives under capitalism. The French writer Edouard Louis, who I haven't read his other books, which will sound really interesting, but it's written a recent book, Who Killed My Father? And the answer is capitalism, basically. But he writes about his father's illness, and he says, this is the point where Emmanuel Macron cut like the unemployment benefit of my father, who was really ill with this. After he'd had this fall in the factory, he had to go back out doing sweeping work, and then he couldn't afford the medication. He goes through he says in a book like this, you don't usually see these people named. You just usually have a story of the suffering father who he had a terrible relationship. He was gay and he struggled with his father, and his father was really angry with. But he said you don't usually hear these people's names mentioned in books like this, and it would appeal to someone like me. But I suggest you read it. It's very short, very powerful kind of book. So I think it requires a political project, simply relying on crisis. As we've seen, we had a global financial crisis in 2008. It hasn't produced a mass left movement. On the contrary, it seems to have produced more of a kind of bonus, if you like, to the nationalist right. So I would agree with the accelerationists. Again, at a kind of basic level, who wouldn't? It's where questions of political organisation kind of always come in, whether you like it or not. You can try and dissolve those questions and say it will come about during the revolution, or it will come about spontaneously from kind of movements, but that's still a kind of claim.
The point of agreement is that there isn't really any kind of outside you start doing it, but the disagreement is the idea that you just push it forward to the point where it collapses.
I think that's broad speaking, because the accelerationists would say, while we're in it, we can transform various parts of its technology, we can transform its kind of structures from within it. Yes, but I would kind of like my suggestion in the book, I guess, I choose different ones. What I propose, which is looking very unlikely, is what I call decommodification. I think making more things in life freely available is better, I think, as a political project than universal basic income, I guess. So, at very basic levels, renationalising things, making public transport free, you know, whether it makes me accelerationist, I kind of agreed with the Labour Party, like make the internet Wi-Fi freely available. It amazed me how angry that made people. Other people getting stuff for free. It's like, cool, yeah. You know, and maybe the internet won't solely be full of right-wing nutcases who can buy their Wi-Fi.
In Malta, that's available everywhere.
All right, I had been to Malta. I didn't realise that.
I mean, there's a very tiny island in the Mediterranean.
Yes, I've been there, yeah.
And if you just go into a cafe on the promenade, you, if the connection to the cafe where you are isn't that good, you can connect to the language school over the road or somewhere else. You don't need their passwords. Whereas if you sit here in this bar here at lunchtime, if the connection here is not good, you can't connect to anybody else apart from the service on your own phone.
Yeah, it's privatised.
So in some parts of the world, it's there. But then the irony I find, personally, being on a very small island like that, where you do notice, not as a tourist, but if you're living there, a big division between the very wealthy and the very poor. And it can be from one street to another. Is that there could be Wi-Fi everywhere because the present Labour government realises that that's the technology of today.
Yeah.
But once you go past the promenade, every road needs to be repaired.
Yeah.
Right, and
well, this would be like Wi-Fi is a necessary but not sufficient condition.
Yeah, and then a lot
just
of
be one
very
condition.
old buildings, very beautiful Maltese architecture. You might find that some months in the year you might not get water for a couple of days. So on one level they have Wi-Fi just by walking down the road, but your grandmother might not have water in the house.
Yeah. Well, this would be the point about decommodification is not just one social good. It would be all the vital social goods. Water being one here we pay for now. You know, health, obviously, student teaching, education. You know, that's why there were redundancies at my university, because universities, like other organisations, like shops, don't seem to be surviving very well in the capitalist marketplace. You know, people particularly criticise universities. Like, have you been on the high street recently? Capitalists aren't doing very well at capitalism, but certainly universities aren't either, because they've basically been privatised. And then they are dependent on student income, so if you don't recruit students, you get made redundant. And one thing that just slightly annoys me, that I'm not making any big claim to, like, you know, I love my job, in fact I really love it, and I get currently well paid for it, but one thing that does annoy me is we don't have tenure in Britain. The debate is so kind of shaped by the US, you know, tenure as a guaranteed job. We don't have that in Britain. You can make me redundant tomorrow through organisational change. So there is no guaranteed job for a UK academic. It often seems to kind of slip in and out of focus to people that way.
Okay. But should academia have, because obviously that's the case for most people in most lines of work.
Yeah, sure.
Should academia have a special privilege in having tenure?
No, I think I'm just saying we don't. The American translation is kind of used by people, but it's not the case.
I see.
That's what I'm saying.
Oh, okay, cool,
As for generally, yes, everyone should have it, if you like. Yeah. Everyone should have both the social protection within their job or you know, through unemployment benefit, or you know, it's like Sweden in the 1970s, to use that bête noire of the American right, where I think, you know, they had like 100% unemployment pay. It was exactly the same, and sick pay was exactly the same, everything was exactly the same as your work. There's this kind of weird book called Fishing in Utopia by a guy who's right-wing. He was writing kind of right-wing columns for Private Eye and The Spectator and magazines like that in the UK while living in Sweden in the late 70s. And he's just like, why are you going to work? Because you could get the same money not going to work. It's like, we want to go to work. He couldn't believe like people were going to work, and he was writing these kind of criticisms of social democracy, these virulent attacks on it, while all the time living in a working social democracy. Which makes her a very weird memoir now about how it's kind of fallen apart.
Also, presumably that was his work.
Yeah.
So he is also doing his, because he loves writing those virulent pieces.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very strange book. It's worth reading for its kind of weird political framework, again, this kind of weird relationship to social democracy. You know, in a sense, the sort of parasitism of the right on social democracy, which still carries on today, even in its absence. this weird recycling of like tropes from the 1970s and 80s. Oh, it's just so boring, like donkey jackets at the cenotaph. It's like, oh, for Corbyn, you've just like recycled something from, what was it, 1984, 3? Oh, God's sake. There was a Will Self thing in the LRB on Owen Hatherley that was recycling cliches from the 70s. It's just like Citizen Smith, if you remember this British comedy of the 70s. It's just like this stuff gets recycled so much. No, so yes, it would be job security for everyone.
Yeah.
I'm not arguing.
No,
I mean, I would like to
no.
keep my job,
with you.
really, definitely, for lots of number of reasons. But yeah, I mean, again, it's the sort of structure of the debates that take place around these things are often highly abstract, I think, and not really attentive to people's conditions of life on either side. I think this is sort of distressing that we don't talk about these things.
Yeah.
We don't really share these experiences because I think sometimes they might be discomforting on all sides. It's a kind of sort of propriety where we all assume, this is a risk, I think, in slogans like, we're all, which I think in many ways is a really powerful one, like the 99% versus the 1%, or this sort of we are all X kind of slogans. They have a truth, but at the same time also they do risk occluding the way we are differentially positioned in relationship to that thing we call capitalism, or you can call wealth, or you can call the means to secure your livelihood, or whatever you want to call it. Yes, I'm going to have to go soon. Yeah.
Is there any last questions?
I mean, I should just call a taxi whenever they turn up. I will run upstairs.
Can I ask just
Yeah, yeah.
You're just saying it seems like you
I've
kind
just
of
got to
have
go to the station.
a slight suspicion of the sort of retro-focused kind of bringing back tropes from the 70s to the 80s.
Yeah, sorry, that's just a personal.
No.
It's nothing much to do with accelerationism.
Well,
It's just like the lack of imagination.
Well, yeah, and the one thing that stood out for me, like I really enjoyed the book Capitalist Realism, right?
Yeah.
On the same publisher, and
Yeah, it's a good book.
the one thing that I found a little bit suspicious about that was this sort of fetishistic, like kind of constant putting forth of the 70s as like a kind of potential utopia that again, this was Fisher's lost futures, etc.
Yeah.
Like, does that critique that you just kind of mentioned also extend to that?
Well, I think again, I would say it's like to have a sort of nuanced understanding. I think in the 70s there were lots of criticisms of social democracy. Correct criticisms around its sexism, its racism, its inability to deal with like various communities, its failure to deliver. But what happened was that these kind of criticisms of social democracy sort of become rote criticisms that still continue in the absence of those forms.
Yeah.
It's like, and then I think they end up becoming rather kind of pro-neoliberal because it becomes like a lack of expectation that these things will take place. So criticisms of the state and what the state provides, fine. But at the same time, we are going to need and want to demand from the state that it do particular things, as we're going to find with coronavirus. Part of what's going on today is like, can you please bloody well do something? And they're kind of like, no, we can't. We're not going to. So again, we have to kind of think here that as, if you like, radicals or people who are on the left or people concerned about these things, we're making demands to the state. No matter what, even if we might think of ourselves as anarchists, we're going to want the state to do something. So I guess what I would say about that 70s thing is, I wouldn't want to romanticise social democracy, but having lived under its sort of end, and my parents were probably on the kind of, they don't admit it, but I think they probably voted Thatcher. We were in Essex in the 70s, we got blamed for it, but we weren't solely responsible. But part of that was working class people didn't want to stay working class. Part of what Thatcher managed to do was galvanise the desire not to be working class. To say, you will have your council house, you will have this source of income, virtual wealth, and you won't have to be working class. So she kind of powerfully galvanised this resentment to having to be in the position of the worker to kind of be central to this imagination of social democracy. So it was a kind of neat switcheroo that she did. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't kind of just be stuck in kind of making the same kind of rants, or just be kind of nuanced about, what are we criticising today? Because I see, Alberto, my friend, was pointing this out to me, in student struggles, often today you get demands for mental health services, whereas in the 60s you were getting demands for their removal, because people didn't want to be pathologised.
Right.
And it's
Yeah.
not that they're wrong, student struggles are wrong to demand mental health services, but I think without understanding how that relates, it's an interesting demand, and how that relates to struggles today because of the NHS failure to provide them. You're kind of asking for the university to provide them. Wouldn't there be potential to develop that struggle so they be provided more generally? Because we're talking about a general social failure to provide mental health services.
Mhm.
And we'd have to rethink, what does it mean now to be demanding mental health services after radical movements were highly critical of them in the 70s for their normalising and pathologising developments, questions Mark raises in interesting ways, So I think, that's what I mean, I think.
I got you.
Is kind of not get stuck in maybe some knee-jerk moves that worked at a particular time or seemed effective, but maybe don't have the same resonance today. This is the thing I have, sorry, on a whole another conversation, but like with Foucault, Foucault's radicalism is radical, but reread also does strike, he writes that book, The Birth of Biopolitics, about neoliberalism, and you can see you are really similar to neoliberalism. I'm not saying Foucault is the same, but some of the moves he is making in his understanding of power and his way he's analysing are very similar, as he says, to Gary Becker and to analysts of neoliberalism. The idea of abolishing the central focus on the state, the idea of kind of pluralities. So it makes for a kind of complicated picture, or at least for me, of things I would have accepted. Like Foucault is in this discussion with Maoists saying like we should have popular justice and hang people in the street. It's like, yeah, that's really radical. But, then you're like, what about these kind of problems about the administration of justice in this case, or the administration of mental health, or, which were worked through by people at the time. Franco Basaglia, the Italian anti-psychiatrist, who's the kind of king of abolishing asylums and succeeded in Italy, which were terrible, was
Thanks for humouring
at the
a very
time of
late
his,
question.
at the time of his death was like working on how we would change it to a new kind of community care. He said it's not enough just to abolish asylums and throw people out and leave them dependent on their families, which was like the worst of all possible worlds. The sense of, sorry, my family are a bit difficult. Your family might often be the cause.
What was his name?
It's Basaglia, Basaglia. And Verso did a big book on him that's not super interesting, but does tell you everything. You know what I mean? Yeah, well, it tells you everything you need to know. But like that new struggle.
Thank you.
Yes,
I just want to say a big
much.
thank you to
No,
Ben
thank
for
you.
coming.
Thanks,
It's been
Bradley.
really
Really
great.
Thank you for your questions. And I'm sorry I have to go.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Exploding Appendix podcast. If you enjoyed this and you'd like to check out more of our work, please visit www.explodingappendix.com. We'd like to take this opportunity to say a special thank you to all those who joined us for the event. Neil Philip Whitehead for his support in recording, and of course, Benjamin Noys. Exploding Appendix, Ideas and Culture with Guts.
Speeding on the freeway, gotta take the lead way. Speed demon, doing it the highway, gotta take it my way. Speed demon, mind is like a compass, I'm stopping enough. Speed demon, he said, pull up a boy and get your ticket right.